The land lay quiet, but it was not the peace of prosperity. It was the silence of exhaustion. Across England, villages stood half-abandoned, fields untended, and cottages sagging under neglect. Travelers on the road saw more burned ruins than thriving markets, more roving men-at-arms than merchants or pilgrims. For almost 20 years, the kingdom had been torn apart by a struggle that chroniclers later called simply the Anarchy. It began with the death of King Henry I in 1135. His only legitimate son had perished years earlier in the wreck of the White Ship, leaving the throne without a clear male heir. Henry named his daughter Matilda as successor, but her claim tested custom and prejudice. Many nobles had sworn oaths to her, yet those promises dissolved quickly when the old king died. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, moved swiftly, seizing the crown with the backing of powerful magnates and the church. With that act, England's descent into chaos began. What followed was not a single decisive war, but a grinding conflict in which fortunes shifted constantly. Stephen, crowned and anointed, sought to rule as king, yet his claim was challenged almost at once when Matilda landed in England in 1139. With her came her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, and eventually her son, Henry of Anjou. The kingdom split along lines of loyalty, and each year brought another siege, another clash, another devastation to the land. Great lords built castles without license, stone fortresses that multiplied like weeds. From these strongholds, they exacted tribute, raided their neighbors, and preyed upon villagers. Chroniclers wrote that Christ and his saints seemed to sleep, for law and justice had vanished. Ordinary life became a struggle for survival. Harvests went uncollected as peasants fled their fields. Markets shrank, for who would risk carrying goods to town when the roads swarmed with soldiers? Coinage grew scarce, trade faltered, and even in London the hum of commerce dimmed. People sought shelter in monasteries, but even the monasteries often lacked food to share. Justice, once enforced by the king's officers, broke down completely. Sheriffs bent to whichever lord held the upper hand. The royal writ, once a powerful command, carried little weight in a realm where the monarchy itself seemed uncertain. Meanwhile, the duel between Stephen and Matilda played out like an endless drama. In 1141, Stephen was captured at the Battle of Lincoln, and for a moment Matilda appeared victorious. She entered London prepared for coronation, only to be driven out by hostile crowds before the crown could touch her head. Later that year, Stephen was released in exchange for Robert of Gloucester, and the struggle resumed. Each side could win battles but not the war, and the kingdom remained suspended in uncertainty. For the people, it mattered little who claimed the crown. What they saw was the collapse of order. Castles loomed as symbols of oppression, not defense. Roads lay empty, villages shrank. Families clung to survival in a world where allegiances shifted with the turning of the wind. Even churches, once sanctuaries of peace, were drawn into the conflict or forced to pay for protection. By the early 1150s, weariness pressed on all. Stephen had aged under the weight of conflict, and the sudden death of his son and heir Eustace left his dynasty without a future. Matilda, proud but exhausted, withdrew to Normandy, leaving her young son Henry to carry her cause. The nobles of England, weary of endless sieges and shifting loyalties, longed for stability. Their castles might have multiplied, but their lands lay empty and their tenants restless. In 1153, the deadlock broke. At Wallingford, a treaty was struck. Stephen would keep his crown until his death, but he acknowledged Henry Plantagenet as his heir. It was not a settlement of triumph, but one of necessity. England was too drained to continue. A year later, Stephen died, and Henry, barely 21 years old, ascended the throne as Henry II. The kingdom he inherited was scarred and fragmented, yet the hunger for order was immense. Villages ruined by years of disorder looked to the young king for renewal. Nobles accustomed to private war now faced a ruler determined to restore authority. The anarchy had left behind a landscape of ruined castles and weary souls, but also the stage for a new dynasty. Henry's challenge was not only to wear the crown, but to knit together a kingdom that had nearly forgotten what stability felt like. From the ashes of anarchy, the foundations of the Plantagenet Dynasty were about to rise. Beyond England's troubled shores, the wider stage of 12th century Europe was shifting in ways that would shape the destiny of every crown. At the center of Christendom, the papacy stood at its zenith. Popes no longer begged for recognition from emperors or kings. Instead, they summoned monarchs to council, issued decrees that reached into every parish, and claimed authority over the salvation of all Christian souls. Rome projected power not through armies but through excommunication, interdict, and the moral weight of faith. A king who defied the Pope risked not only his own soul, but the loyalty of subjects who feared eternal loss. In this climate, the papacy was more than a spiritual force. It was the arbiter of legitimacy. To the east, the Holy Roman Empire loomed vast in theory, but fractured in practice. Germany was a patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, and free cities, each jealous of its rights and wary of imperial demands. The emperor could command in name, but in reality he bargained constantly with princes whose armies and wealth gave them independent strength. South of the Alps, Italy remained divided as well. The north prospered with rising communes like Milan and Florence, where merchants grew rich from trade, while the south was shaped by the Normans who carved out principalities in Apulia and Sicily. It was a land of opportunity and conflict, where papal ambition and imperial claims collided endlessly. To the west, across the Channel from England, the Capuchin kings of France clung to a modest domain. Their authority extended securely only over the Ile-de-France, a territory small compared to the sprawling lands held by dukes and counts. Yet though weak in the short term, the Capetians possessed resilience. They cultivated alliances, fostered loyalty among towns, and slowly reasserted their crown's dignity. Paris, still far from the great city it would become, already glowed as a symbol of learning and stability. While France seemed fragile beside its mighty lords, its monarchy carried within it the seeds of eventual supremacy. Spain, though distant from Henry's immediate concerns, was in the midst of the long Reconquista. Christian kingdoms like Castile and Aragon pressed southward against Muslim states, forging a frontier society of knights, peasants, and monks, united by the promise of faith and land. Their struggles drew the attention of the papacy and of adventurers from across Europe, a reminder that the bonds of Christendom stretched beyond any single realm. Placed against this backdrop, England's plight during the Anarchy might appear unique, yet it was part of a larger pattern. All across Europe, authority and order were fragile, tested by war, ambition, and shifting loyalties. What distinguished England was not that it suffered, but that it possessed the potential to recover swiftly once a firm hand returned to the throne. Unlike the German principalities, England was not hopelessly divided by language or law. Unlike Italy, it was not split between papal and imperial claims. Unlike France, its monarchy had once ruled with centralized efficiency, and that memory still lingered in the minds of barons and bishops. The Anarchy had battered institutions, but it had not destroyed them. In this sense, the kingdom stood at a crossroads. It was diminished, but not broken, weary, but not beyond renewal. The very exhaustion of its people and nobles created a yearning for stability that a determined ruler could answer. If such a ruler could master both the sword and the law, if he could navigate the demands of the papacy, hold his own against the Capuchins, and resist the entanglements of the empire, then England might not only recover, but rise as a force across the continent. It was into this Europe, vibrant and divided, that Henry Plantagenet would step when he claimed his inheritance. He would confront a pope who expected obedience, a French crown eager to reclaim authority, and an empire whose princes looked east and south with ambition. Yet he would also inherit a realm with deep resources, a tradition of strong kingship, and the advantage of insular geography. These elements, when combined with his will and vision, promised more than mere survival. They hinted at empire, at dynasty, at the possibility that from the wreckage of civil war, a new age might dawn. Thus, while England's fields still bore the scars of neglect, and its people still remembered years of disorder, the wider world presented both threat and opportunity. To rebuild at home was only the first step. To thrive abroad, Henry would need to measure himself against the great powers of his age. The papacy's towering shadow, the cautious strength of the Capetians, the fractured might of the empire, and the restless energy of southern Europe would all test him. The story of his reign would not be written solely in the halls of Westminster, but also in the balance of power that defined 12th century Europe. He was born into exile and uncertainty, a child whose destiny was shaped by conflict before he could walk. Henry Plantagenet entered the world in 1133, son of Geoffrey of Anjou and the Empress Matilda, the woman who had once been crowned as bride of the Holy Roman Emperor and later returned to England as claimant to its throne. His lineage carried both prestige and peril. On his mother's side, he was the grandson of Henry I of England, the last great Norman ruler. On his father's side, he belonged to the Counts of Anjou, a house known for energy, restlessness, and a fierce independence of spirit. From the beginning, he was heir to two traditions, one Norman, one Angevin, destined to collide and merge in his character. Henry's childhood was far from the safety of a settled court. While Stephen wore England's crown, Matilda and Geoffrey struggled across the Channel to preserve their son's inheritance. Normandy was contested, Anjou restless, Aquitaine distant and uncertain. In such an environment, the boy was not sheltered but hardened. He grew up watching his parents contend with enemies, learning that fortune in politics was as fragile as the walls of a besieged castle. Those early years taught him resilience. He discovered quickly that security was never given, only taken, and that power came not from noble titles alone, but from the strength to defend them. As he matured, Normandy became his training ground. Its rugged landscapes and turbulent politics demanded resourcefulness. The young Henry rode across its fields with tutors, knights, and clerics, who drilled into him both the arts of war and the habits of governance. He learned to wield a sword, but also to listen to counsel, to read charters, and to understand the tangled web of feudal obligation that bound lords to their king. The lessons of Normandy were as much legal as military, for Henry grasped early that law, written and enforced, could be as potent a weapon as steel. In Anjou, his father's domain, Henry absorbed another legacy. The Angevin counts were known for their relentless energy, their ceaseless riding across territories, never lingering long in one place. They governed not from static courts, but from movement itself, always present, always visible, always asserting control. Henry adopted this rhythm as his own. Throughout his life, he would be remembered for his restlessness, for the way he traversed his vast dominions, never content to remain idle. It was the mark of his Angevin blood, fused with Norman discipline, that produced a character uniquely suited for empire. Those who encountered Henry in his youth remarked on his intensity. He was not tall, nor was he strikingly handsome, but his presence commanded attention. His eyes, sharp and restless, seemed to burn with an inner fire. Chroniclers later wrote that he rarely sat still, that his hands fidgeted, his feet tapped, his body vibrated with energy, even in council. He was ambitious beyond measure, but his ambition was not reckless. Beneath it lay a mind attuned to order, to rules, to the potential of law as the foundation of authority. Unlike many young nobles who saw kingship as privilege, Henry understood it as labor. The trials of his mother's cause imprinted themselves upon him. As a boy, he witnessed Matilda's struggles against Stephen, saw how victory at one moment dissolved into defeat the next. He learned that even the strongest claim could falter without support, and that legitimacy required more than blood. From her, he inherited determination, a refusal to yield even when the odds seemed impossible. From his father, he absorbed the Angevin instinct for ceaseless motion and practical command. From both parents, he gained a sense of destiny that would not allow him to remain a minor count or regional lord. His horizon was always the crown of England. In the early 1150s, when Henry was still in his teens, he tested his strength. Crossing into England with a modest force, he sought to challenge Stephen directly. The venture faltered, more a rehearsal than a triumph, but it revealed his audacity. Few youths of 17 would dare invade a kingdom. Henry not only dared, he emerged from failure undaunted, returning to Normandy with renewed resolve. Such episodes displayed the essence of his character. Setbacks were never final, only lessons on the path to greater power. By the time Stephen's reign faltered and the Treaty of Wallingford was signed, Henry's reputation had grown. He was no longer just the exiled son of a disputed claimant. He had become Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and by marriage soon to be Duke of Aquitaine, husband to Eleanor, one of the most formidable women of her age. The boy who once followed tutors on horseback now led armies, bargained with kings, and carried the hopes of a dynasty. Yet even at that stage, Henry was defined as much by potential as by accomplishment. Those who looked into his eyes saw a hunger not easily satisfied. He sought not merely to rule, but to restore order to a land scarred by anarchy, to impose a system where chaos had reigned. His ambition reached beyond conquest to structure, beyond possession to permanence. It was this vision, nurtured in the fires of exile and the uncertainty of youth, that distinguished him from others who had worn the crown before. When Henry at last rode into England as heir apparent, the image was powerful. A young man astride his horse, the banner of Anjou fluttering, his gaze set not on fleeting glory, but on the lasting foundations of rule. His journey from exiled boy to rising monarch was not yet complete, but already the outlines of his reign could be discerned. Ambition, endurance, and a mind sharpened by law would define him. The kingdom awaited, weary of chaos, ready for the relentless energy of a king who had been shaped by struggle from his very first days. By the summer of 1153, the kingdom was weary beyond measure. 2 decades of shifting battles, broken oaths, and ceaseless sieges had drained its spirit. Castles that once stood as proud symbols of authority were scarred with the marks of countless skirmishes. Fields once green with harvest had been left barren, and villages longed for stability more than victory. England had reached a point where even the great lords, accustomed to power and conflict, recognized that endless war brought no profit. What they craved now was peace, and in that yearning lay the conditions for an agreement that would change the fate of the realm. Stephen, who had fought so long to hold the crown, could no longer ignore the reality pressing in on him. Age and exhaustion weighed heavily. His vigor of youth had faded, and the sudden loss of his son Eustace in 1153 struck at both heart and dynasty. Without an heir of his own, his struggle against the House of Anjou seemed increasingly futile. To persist in defiance meant condemning the kingdom to yet more years of turmoil. To concede, however painful, offered at least the possibility that his name might not be forever linked with ruin. Across the Channel, and now in England itself, stood Henry Plantagenet, barely in his 20s, yet already seasoned by the hardships of exile and the responsibilities of vast continental domains. He carried with him not only the claim of his mother, but also the promise of renewal. The lords who had grown disillusioned with Stephen's reign found in Henry a figure who might reimpose order, a man whose energy, ambition, and command offered hope. For the bishops, weary of churches being plundered and justice ignored, Henry represented the chance of restoring sacred law and civil stability. The two sides came together near Wallingford. It was not a gathering marked by triumphal banners or the thunder of drums, but by the quiet recognition that peace was the only path forward. Negotiations, guided by bishops and magnates, pressed both king and heir into compromise. The result was the Treaty of Wallingford. Its terms were simple yet profound. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but he would acknowledge Henry Plantagenet as his adopted son and lawful successor. This arrangement was not the crowning of a victor, but the release of a nation from stalemate. Neither Stephen nor Henry could claim outright conquest, but together they allowed England to breathe again. Chroniclers tell of the relief that swept across the land, of men laying down their arms, of castles dismantled at last, of families daring to hope that their children might grow up in peace rather than uncertainty. For Stephen, the treaty was both concession and redemption. By naming Henry his heir, he preserved at least a fragment of dignity, ensuring that the transition of power would be orderly, not chaotic. For Henry, it was a triumph not of battle, but of patience, diplomacy, and the undeniable logic of legitimacy. He would inherit a throne without having to tear it further apart, and he could begin to imagine the work of reconstruction rather than constant war. The Treaty of Wallingford stands as a reminder that history is not shaped only by victories on the battlefield, but also by moments of weary wisdom, when men set aside ambition for the sake of stability. It was the calm after the storm, fragile yet essential. From this calm, Henry would soon step forward as Henry II, King of England, founder of a dynasty that would rule for centuries. And, for us, Looking back on these events, there is something timeless in the story. Out of division can come renewal. From exhaustion can emerge resolve. The voices of the past remind us that endurance and vision matter as much as force, that even in the darkest years, the seeds of order may yet take root. To follow the journey of Henry II is to witness how one man, born into exile, could seize such a moment and transform it into destiny. It is a story worth keeping alive, not merely as history, but as a testament to resilience and renewal. And as we continue down this path of discovery together, the chapters ahead will reveal just how vast an empire this young king was destined to build. The year 1154 brought the final turning of an era. King Stephen, worn by years of conflict and shadowed by the compromises of Wallingford, felt the weight of time upon him. His reign had begun with sudden ambition and had endured through trial, but now it approached its inevitable close. In October, Stephen's health failed while he was traveling in the east of England. The king who had once ridden at the head of armies, who had fought to hold the crown against all rivals, now lay in decline, and with him, the last fragile hold of his dynasty. The realm watched with a quiet mixture of expectation and apprehension. The treaty had declared Henry of Anjou to be Stephen's heir, but in a land so long accustomed to uncertainty, nothing seemed secure until the moment arrived. Nobles, bishops, and common folk alike wondered whether the succession would proceed peacefully or whether new storms would break once more across the Channel. For nearly 20 years, England had known little else but instability, and the memory of broken promises was still sharp. When Stephen died in Dover on the 25th of October, the transition unfolded with remarkable calm. Unlike the sudden seizures of power that had marked 1135, there was no scramble for the crown, no rival claimant rushing to Westminster. The magnates who had so often changed allegiance in the past now stood together, weary of conflict and eager to see order restored. Messages sped across the sea to summon Henry, who was in Normandy when the news reached him. The moment for which his mother had fought and his father had schemed, the destiny he had carried from childhood, had finally come to meet him. Henry crossed the Channel in early December, landing at Dover, the very place where Stephen's life had ended weeks earlier. The symbolism was striking. One king gone, another arriving to claim the mantle. From there, he made his way to London, welcome not with the uncertainty that had greeted his mother years before, but with processions of clergy and nobles who recognized in him the promise of renewal. For the first time in a generation, England saw the possibility of a smooth and legitimate succession. On the 19th of December, in Westminster Abbey, Henry was crowned King of England. He was 21 years old, young for the burdens he was about to bear, yet hardened by exile, campaigns, and responsibility beyond his years. The ceremony, steeped in ancient ritual, carried more than solemnity. It carried relief. As the anointing oil touched his forehead and the crown was set upon his head, the congregation saw not only the beginning of a reign, but the end of an age of uncertainty. The coronation of Henry II marked the dawn of the Plantagenet Dynasty, the boy who had ridden restless through Normandy and Anjou, who had tasted failure and learned resilience, who had been the instrument of his mother's claim and the heir of his father's ambitions, now stood as the ruler of a kingdom hungry for order. His task was immense. England was scarred, its governance fragmented, its treasury weakened. Castles still dotted the landscape as symbols of unchecked power. Law needed to be restored, justice revived, and authority reasserted. Yet in that very challenge lay opportunity. Contemporaries noted the vigor of the new king. He did not linger long in ceremony or indulgence. His coronation was not the culmination of a dream, but the beginning of a mission. Henry moved quickly to assert his authority, recalling the lessons of youth. That kingship was labor, not luxury, and that stability came only through tireless effort. He was, at 21, a monarch of immense territories, England, Normandy, Anjou, and soon Aquitaine through his marriage, and he seemed determined to govern them with the restless energy that had marked his character since boyhood. The death of Stephen, quiet and unremarkable in its passing, became significant in its consequence. It allowed a realm long divided to turn the page without fresh bloodshed or betrayal. It offered the rare gift of continuity in a time when dynasties often collapsed under the strain of succession. And it set the stage for Henry II to begin a reign that would not only restore order, but reshape the very foundations of English kingship. Thus, the crown passed from a weary king who had fought desperately to keep it to a young ruler whose destiny was to redefine its power. England, scarred but not broken, placed its hopes in the hands of Henry Plantagenet, and with his coronation, a new chapter in the story of the realm began. The coronation of Henry II did more than place a crown upon his head. It invited comparison with the rulers who had come before him. The English monarchy had already known figures of great weight. William the Conqueror had been the iron founder, seizing a kingdom by force of arms and holding it through fear and calculation. His son Henry I had been the administrator, the clerk king whose legal charters and stern discipline gave England a framework of governance. Between them stood William Rufus, remembered less for achievement than for arrogance and sudden death in the forest. And after Henry I, the long interlude of Stephen's reign had brought turmoil rather than stability, a time in which the image of kingship itself had faltered. Against this backdrop, the young Henry appeared as something different, neither the conqueror of foreign birth nor the weary figure of civil war, but a monarch who embodied both strength and renewal. He had not seized England by battle, though he had fought for his place. He had not inherited it in peace, though his bloodline was legitimate. Instead, he represented the return of order through persistence, diplomacy, and the quiet recognition that legitimacy could not be ignored forever. At 21, he was both an heir and a reformer, carrying forward the legacy of his Norman grandfather while promising to adapt it to the needs of a scarred realm. Observers soon noticed qualities that set him apart. Where William the Conqueror had been stern and unyielding, Henry II was decisive but pragmatic, willing to adjust his approach if it secured the end he desired. Where Stephen had been accused of weakness, bending too easily to magnates and allowing castles to flourish unchecked, Henry made clear that he would tolerate no erosion of royal authority. He moved with a sense of purpose that left little doubt about his intentions. The crown under his hand would not be a prize for others to manipulate, but a tool for restoring the very structure of governance. Discipline marked his reign from the outset. Henry carried himself with a restless energy, but it was not the aimless fidgeting of youth. It was the urgency of a man who felt time pressing upon him. He did not linger in celebration, nor did he surround himself with frivolous spectacle. Instead, he began to dismantle the adulterine castles that had risen during the Anarchy, reminding barons that fortresses were not private kingdoms, but property of the crown. He summoned sheriffs to account for revenues, reasserting the authority of the exchequer. These were not glamorous actions, yet they spoke to a deeper resolve that kingship meant order, not indulgence. More than his predecessors, Henry saw the law as the instrument of monarchy. Henry I had established charters and precedents, but Henry II intended to weave them into something more lasting. He believed that authority was not secured only by armies or castles, but by rules that bound lords and commoners alike, rules enforced not sporadically, but systematically. His legal mind, sharpened from youth, regarded disputes not as inconveniences, but as opportunities to extend royal justice. In this, he was unlike William Rufus, who had cared little for fairness, or Stephen, who had too often ceded control to powerful magnates. Henry aimed to make the law an extension of himself, a reflection of his presence in every shire court and judgment. Contemporaries noted the impression he gave in council and in the field. He was vigorous, direct, often impatient, but he listened when counsel was wise and acted swiftly once a decision was made. Unlike Stephen, who was often indecisive, Henry rarely hesitated. Unlike William the Conqueror, who inspired awe and fear, Henry inspired respect through relentless effort. He demanded loyalty, but he also offered the promise that under his rule, the machinery of governance would once again function. To follow Henry was to follow stability, and after 20 years of disorder, that promise was powerful indeed. Thus, the image of the young king stood in sharp contrast with what had come before. He was no foreign invader, no weak placeholder, no careless ruler undone by chance. He was a monarch who combined ambition with discipline, vision with legal clarity. He embodied the lessons of the past, yet refused to be shackled by them. In his eyes burned the determination of one who had known exile and struggle. In his movements, the urgency of one who believed kingship was work without rest. In him, England found not just a new sovereign, but a new model of monarchy, one that did not rely solely on fear or tradition, but sought to rebuild through decision, discipline, and law. It was the image of a king, young in years but already old in experience, ready to reshape the realm according to his will. And as the crown settled upon his brow, the people of England saw in Henry II not only the end of chaos, but the beginning of a reign that promised endurance, structure, and authority, unlike any they had known in a generation. When Henry II assumed the throne, the scars of the Anarchy were not only visible in weary faces and neglected fields, they were carved into the very landscape of the realm. Across England, castles had risen like thorns in the soil, hundreds of them built hastily and often without the king's permission. These were the so-called adulterine castles, products of a lawless age when local lords no longer feared royal command and fortified their own authority with stone and timber. For 2 decades, they had stood as symbols of disorder, each one a reminder that the crown's writ had been ignored. Henry understood at once that no restoration of royal power could succeed while these unauthorized fortresses still loomed over the countryside. Each adulterine castle represented not only walls and towers, but also defiance, a visible statement that the king's authority was optional. To leave them standing would mean to admit weakness, to concede that England was no longer a single kingdom, but a patchwork of private dominions. For Henry, so young and so intent on re-establishing the crown's dignity, this was unacceptable. In the first years of his reign, he turned his energy to dismantling them. Chroniclers speak of more than 300 castles torn down, their walls reduced, their keeps leveled, their timbers scattered. The policy was not mere destruction for its own sake. It was a deliberate act of reassertion. By pulling down the stones of rebellion, Henry was building the invisible but far stronger edifice of obedience. The message was unmistakable. The crown alone could sanction fortification. The king alone could command defense. The work of demolition was vast, stretching across counties from the Welsh marches to the shires of the east. Some castles fell quickly, their garrisons unable to resist the royal will. Others were surrendered by lords who calculated that defiance would only bring harsher punishment. A few were absorbed, permitted to remain but only under strict royal license. But the majority were broken, their ruins left as mute testimony to the folly of building power without royal sanction. Where once stood towers of ambition, now lay heaps of rubble, reminders that the age of private warlords was ending. For the people, the sight of these demolitions brought a measure of relief. Villagers who had lived in the shadow of predatory garrisons saw the walls crumble and felt the weight of oppression lift. Markets reopened where once roads had been blocked by tolls and threats. Monks and clerics recorded with gratitude that justice was returning, that the nightmare of castles built by force and used against the weak was finally passing. Henry's policy was not simply about stone and mortar, it was about restoring trust that the king could and would protect his subjects. To his contemporaries, this campaign revealed Henry's character in action. He was decisive, direct, and unafraid of alienating magnates when the integrity of the crown was at stake. Unlike Stephen, who had tolerated the proliferation of fortresses in exchange for fragile support, Henry chose confrontation over compromise. He believed that discipline, once imposed, would yield respect, and respect would yield obedience. The crown had to be feared not for cruelty, but for constancy, for its refusal to yield when principles were at stake. The dismantling of adulterine castles also marked a symbolic turning point in the history of English monarchy. Never again would unauthorized castles spread, unchecked across the land. Future kings might quarrel with their barons, might wage wars abroad and at home, but the lesson had been set. Fortification belonged to the sovereign, not to private ambition. The authority of the state, embodied in the crown, stood above the ambitions of individuals. It was a cornerstone of the new order Henry was constructing, a world where law and royal command would once again define the kingdom. Thus, as the ruins of 300 castles dotted the countryside, they told a new story. No longer monuments to anarchy, they became monuments to renewal, to a king who chose to break in order to build. In the silence that followed their collapse, England began to hear once more the steady voice of royal authority, firm and unyielding, guiding the realm out of the shadows of civil war and into the disciplined light of a restored monarchy. The dismantling of adulterine castles was only the beginning. For Henry II, true stability would come not from pulling down stone walls alone, but from re-establishing the invisible architecture of royal authority. England had endured 20 years in which noble families had ruled like miniature kings, their word more powerful in the shires than that of the crown. Sheriffs had been bought, justice ignored, and the feudal order warped until the great magnates stood almost as sovereigns in their own domains. To restore the kingdom, Henry needed to cut down this overgrowth of aristocratic power and reassert the authority of the crown in every corner of his realm. From the first councils of his reign, Henry made his intentions plain. He would not tolerate a monarchy weakened by compromise. Chroniclers describe him in these gatherings, a young king, wrapped in a cloak of deep crimson, standing tall before the gathered lords. His voice was sharp and firm, not raised in anger, but resonant with command. Gone was the uncertainty that had marked Stephen's assemblies, where barons dictated terms. In Henry's presence, it was clear who would now set the law. His strategy was multifaceted. First, he tightened the crown's grip on the sheriffs, those key officials whose authority reached into every county. Under Stephen, many sheriffs had grown rich and independent, using their office to extort revenues and shield their patrons. Henry replaced them with men loyal to himself, often of lesser rank, chosen not for noble blood, but for competence and fidelity. In doing so, he struck a blow at the great barons who had once controlled the levers of local power. Second, Henry revived the exchequer, the financial heart of the monarchy. Under his grandfather Henry I, it had functioned with precision, but during Stephen's reign it had faltered, its revenues diverted into private hands. Henry restored its discipline, demanding strict accounts, insisting that sheriffs appeared to render sums before his treasurers. Money, as much as castles, was power, and by reclaiming it, the crown could once again stand above its lords. Third, Henry asserted the right of the king's justice over that of private courts. Magnates had grown used to holding sway in their own halls, settling disputes according to preference. Henry began to expand the reach of royal courts, ensuring that certain cases could only be heard under the crown's authority. This was not yet the full flowering of the common law that would come later, but its seeds were planted in these years. To every noble who might consider himself a king in miniature, the message was unmistakable. Law flowed from the monarch. It was a delicate balance. Henry needed the barons to support his reign, yet he refused to let them imagine themselves his equals. He ruled not by sheer terror, but by unrelenting assertion, a ceaseless reminder that the king was present, vigilant, and determined. He summoned lords to his court frequently, kept them moving with him across his itinerant kingdom, and demanded service not only in arms, but in counsel and revenue. The crown was no longer a distant symbol, but a daily reality. For the people of England, this renewal of authority was not always gentle, but it was reassuring. The same king who ordered castles demolished now brought the great men to heel, ending the sense that every district was a fiefdom unto itself. The sight of Henry in his red cloak, commanding obedience from nobles who once defied kings, carried a power that extended beyond ceremony. It was the image of monarchy reborn, not as indulgence, but as discipline. The chroniclers were keen to emphasize this transformation. Where Stephen had been pliable, Henry was unbending. Where others wavered, he pressed forward with restless energy. His authority was not absolute. Barons remained powerful, and compromise was sometimes necessary. But the direction of the monarchy had shifted. The crown was once again the central pillar of the realm, and the nobility, though still proud, were bound within its orbit. In these years, Henry was building more than just the strength of his own reign. He was laying the foundations for a dynasty. The Plantagenet house would endure not only because of its lands and marriages, but because Henry re-established the principle that the king's authority stood above all. His successors, whether strong or weak, would inherit a crown fortified by the structures he rebuilt. Thus, as England emerged from the long twilight of civil war, the figure of Henry II in his crimson robe, commanding the great lords, became emblematic of a new age. He was not merely a young king inheriting a scarred kingdom. He was the architect of its renewal. In his discipline, his decisiveness, and his insistence on the authority of the crown, he restored to England what it had lost, the knowledge that the realm had one master, and that master was the king. The restoration of castles and the disciplining of the nobility were visible acts, but Henry II knew that the true strength of monarchy lay in the less dramatic machinery of governance. The crown could not stand on force of arms alone. It needed steady revenues, careful administration, and a system that reminded every subject, lord and peasant alike, that the king's authority was constant, not occasional. To this end, Henry turned his attention to the exchequer, the financial and administrative heart of the realm, and through it began to lay the foundations of a more centralized state. The exchequer had once been the pride of Henry I's reign. It was a place where royal sheriffs brought in their accounts, where sums of silver were weighed on great checkered cloths, and where officials trained in arithmetic and record-keeping ensured that the king's revenues flowed in orderly fashion. But during the long anarchy, this structure had crumbled. Sheriffs had withheld money or diverted it to their patrons. Tallies were neglected, and the royal treasury became a shadow of itself. Under Stephen, financial order was sacrificed for political expediency, as favors were granted to secure loyalty. By the time Henry II ascended the throne, the exchequer was little more than a hollow institution. Henry's instinct was to revive it with ruthless energy. He summoned sheriffs to appear before his treasurers, demanded they account for every penny, and punished negligence with dismissal. He brought in officials of proven competence, men who were not necessarily noble, but who could be trusted for their skill and loyalty. For the first time in years, revenues began to flow with regularity, and the monarchy's ability to act independently of baronial largesse was restored. Chroniclers speak of the king's constant attention to financial detail, his insistence on accuracy, and his refusal to allow the exchequer to sink again into laxity. These reforms went beyond mere bookkeeping. They marked the rebirth of central authority. With a disciplined exchequer, the crown no longer depended entirely on the goodwill of its magnates for support. It had its own income, its own system of oversight, and thus the ability to project power across the realm. The king could fund campaigns, dispatch justices, and sustain his household without begging for noble contributions. The monarchy was no longer at the mercy of baronial treasuries. It was re-establishing itself as the central axis around which the entire kingdom revolved. Alongside financial reform came administrative change. Henry's government moved constantly with him, itinerant, restless, echoing the Angevin habit of ceaseless travel. Yet wherever he went, the business of the realm followed, written on parchment, carried by clerks, preserved in rolls. It was under Henry that the famous pipe rolls, annual records of the crown's income and expenditure, became a consistent feature. They survive as some of the oldest continuous governmental records in Europe, testimony to a system that was beginning to think of itself not as the king's whim, but as an institution in its own right. The implications were profound. In an age when many kingdoms remained loose federations of lords, Henry's England was moving toward something stronger, something closer to a state. The sheriffs no longer served only as local magnates. They were bound into a network that reported upward to the exchequer and ultimately to the king. The justices dispatched to hear pleas carried royal authority into villages and towns, reminding people that law and order were not local privileges, but the gift of the crown. The symbolism of this centralization mattered as much as its practical results. When subjects paid their dues at the exchequer, when they saw records entered on parchment, they witnessed the reach of monarchy extending beyond castles and coronations into the fabric of daily life. The authority of the king was not only visible in moments of war or ceremony, but present in accounts, audits, and laws. It was an authority woven into the rhythm of governance. Henry himself embodied this relentless order. He was known for his restless energy, for his refusal to allow negligence. Where others might have left administration to clerks, he took an active interest, reading charters, hearing disputes, pressing for detail. He could be impatient, even brusque, but his impatience was that of a ruler who believed the monarchy must be not only strong, but efficient. In his view, a king who failed to govern with discipline invited disorder. By restoring the exchequer and imposing administrative rigor, Henry II laid the cornerstones of a centralized monarchy that would outlast his reign. His successors would build upon it, sometimes wisely, sometimes poorly, but the structures he revived ensured that England would never again be quite the same. The crown was no longer merely the ornament of a noble dynasty. It was the engine of a state in formation. Thus, in the quiet halls where silver was counted and records inscribed, as much as on the fields where armies marched, the fate of the Plantagenet Dynasty was secured. Henry's vision reached beyond the moment. He was building not just for himself, but for generations to come, establishing a monarchy whose strength lay not only in the sword, but in the enduring machinery of governance. Before Henry II ascended the throne of England, an event in his personal life had already transformed the scale of his power. In 1152, 2 years before he became king, Henry married Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages. With this union, Henry did not merely gain a consort. He inherited dominion over some of the richest lands in France, stretching from the Loire to the Pyrenees, lands larger and wealthier than those directly held by the French king himself. The marriage was both a love story of ambition and a political revolution, one that reshaped the map of Europe and redefined the balance of power between monarch and vassal. Eleanor was no ordinary bride. She was the heiress of Aquitaine, duchess in her own right, and one of the most powerful women of her century. Years earlier, she had been Queen of France, married to Louis VII, and had journeyed with him on the Second Crusade. That union, however, had soured. Louis, pious and cautious, proved ill-suited to Eleanor's fiery spirit and expansive vision. Their marriage ended in annulment, and Eleanor returned to Aquitaine with her titles intact. Few women of the age commanded such wealth and influence, and fewer still carried such a force of personality. Proud, intelligent, and unafraid to speak her mind, Eleanor needed a partner who could match her strength. Henry, ambitious and vigorous, was that partner. Barely 19 when they met, he was already Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, seasoned by campaigns and brimming with restless energy. The match was swift, some said scandalously so, for Eleanor married Henry only weeks after her annulment. Yet the union was less scandal than inevitability, the joining of two figures who understood both their own power and the possibilities that lay in combining it. Together, they embodied not only youth and vitality, but also a shared determination to command their destiny. The marriage expanded Henry's influence on a scale unimaginable for most rulers of his time. Through Eleanor, he gained control of Aquitaine, a duchy famed for its vineyards, its troubadours, and its courts of culture as much as for its wealth. Added to his holdings in Anjou, Normandy, and soon England itself, Henry's dominions stretched across half of France. The Capuchin king, Louis VII, was reduced to ruling little more than the Ile-de-France, while his former wife and her new husband held lands that dwarfed his own. It was a humiliation for Louis, a triumph for Henry, and a development that would set France and England on a collision course for centuries. Chroniclers describe the pair in vivid terms. Eleanor, regal and proud, carried herself with the authority of a sovereign in her own right. Henry, broad-shouldered and intense, exuded the vigor of a young man destined for greatness. When they appeared together, she radiant, he resolute, they seemed a balance of equals, a union of fire and iron. Their marriage was not the quiet submission of wife to husband, but a partnership of strong wills, two figures whose combined influence would dominate courts and kingdoms alike. Their personalities, though complementary, often clashed. Eleanor's wit and independence sometimes met Henry's impatience and determination head-on. Yet these tensions only underscored the vitality of their bond. They were not passive figures of ceremony, but active rulers, each shaping policy, patronage, and culture. Eleanor brought to Henry's court a refinement of taste and a circle of poets and thinkers, enriching the cultural life of the Plantagenet domains. Henry, in turn, brought discipline, law, and the relentless drive to impose order. The union of Henry and Eleanor was more than a marriage. It was a political earthquake. It created an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, a realm so vast that contemporaries called it the Angevin Empire. Though it was not a single unified state, it gave Henry resources and prestige unmatched by any English king before him. It also ensured that his reign would be defined not only by his rule in England, but by his constant engagement with continental politics, forever balancing the demands of Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and his restless barons at home. In this marriage, the seeds of both triumph and turmoil were sown. For Henry, Eleanor was a partner who elevated him beyond any of his rivals, giving him both legitimacy and resources. For Eleanor, Henry was the forceful consort who matched her ambition and energy. Together, they became one of the most formidable couples in medieval history, their presence commanding respect, their union altering the course of kingdoms. The image of Eleanor, proud in her bearing, and Henry, firm in his command, stands as a vision of a partnership that was at once personal and profoundly political. It was in this alliance that the foundations of Plantagenet power were laid, an empire not forged only in battle, but sealed in marriage. By the middle of the 12th century, through inheritance, conquest, and marriage, Henry II had become master of an empire whose scale astonished his contemporaries. Though never called by that name in his own day, chroniclers later described it as the Angevin Empire, a patchwork of territories bound together not by a single crown, but by the restless energy of one man and the loyalty and/or submission of those who served him. From the northern seas to the Pyrenees, from the ports of Normandy to the vineyards of Aquitaine, Henry's dominion stretched wider than that of any English king before him. At its heart was England, scarred by years of anarchy, but still a kingdom of immense resources. Its shires and towns, once subdued under Norman authority, now looked to Henry for the restoration of law and order. Across the Channel lay Normandy, the duchy of his ancestors, the land that had given the English monarchy its character and strength since the conquest of 1066. To Normandy was joined Anjou, cradle of Henry's own house, a land of rugged castles and vigorous lords, whose tradition of restless rule Henry embodied in his own ceaseless travels. Through his marriage with Eleanor, Aquitaine was added to this dominion. Aquitaine was not merely a duchy, it was a world unto itself, rich in culture and wealth. Its courts nurtured poets and troubadours, its lands produced some of Europe's finest wines, and its people looked to Eleanor with loyalty that no northern ruler could easily command. Alongside Aquitaine lay Gascony, with its ports and fertile valleys, a vital link to the trade of the south and the routes that led across the Pyrenees into Iberia. These lands, bound together under Henry's rule, created a mosaic of cultures, languages, and traditions, each distinct yet all united under the authority of one king. Even Ireland was drawn into his sphere. In 1171, Henry would land there to assert his overlordship, marking the beginning of centuries of English involvement on the island. Though his control was incomplete and contested, the claim added yet another dimension to his dominion, signaling that the Plantagenet reach extended not only across France, but also into the Celtic fringes of the British Isles. Measured against the holdings of the Capetian kings of France, Henry's dominions were extraordinary. The French king, Louis XVII, nominally overlord of much of Henry's continental lands, ruled directly over only a narrow strip of territory around Paris and Orléans, the Île-de-France. In contrast, Henry commanded territories that dwarfed the royal domain of France. His rule stretched across half the kingdom, leaving the French monarch in the paradoxical position of being weaker in land and wealth than his own vassal. This imbalance of power would shape the politics of France and England for generations, planting the seeds of rivalry that would one day explode into the 100 Years' War. The Angevin Empire was not a unified state in the modern sense. Each land retained its own customs, its own laws, and its own loyalties. A peasant in Yorkshire might share little with a merchant in Bordeaux, and a knight in Anjou might feel more kinship with his neighbors in Touraine than with lords across the Channel. What bound them was not shared nationhood, but the authority of Henry himself, his ability to be present, to command, and to enforce. His rule was itinerant. He moved constantly from one territory to another, holding court in Winchester, Rouen, Poitiers, and Bordeaux, leaving behind the imprint of authority wherever he went. This ceaseless motion was both strength and burden. It allowed Henry to keep a watchful eye on his diverse lands, to remind his subjects that their ruler was never far away. Yet it also meant that the empire depended heavily on his personal energy and presence. There was no central bureaucracy that could unify England, Normandy, and Aquitaine. There was only the determination of one king to hold together a realm that was larger, richer, and more complex than that of the Capetians. To contemporaries, the scale of Henry's dominion seemed both awe-inspiring and precarious. It was an empire of opportunity, a chance to command resources and influence across Europe. Yet it was also an empire of tensions, where different languages, cultures, and expectations could as easily divide as unite. For the moment, Henry's vigor and authority held it all together, making him one of the most powerful rulers of his age. The sight of his red cloak in council, his sharp eyes surveying his lords, symbolized a monarchy whose reach extended across seas and mountains. Thus the Angevin Empire stood: England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, Gascony, and even the first footholds in Ireland, all under the command of one man. It was greater in extent than the lands ruled directly by the King of France. A patchwork, yet a marvel, fragile, yet formidable. In the hands of Henry II, it was not merely a collection of territories, but a vision of power unprecedented in the medieval West, a dominion that would shape the destinies of kingdoms for centuries to come. The Angevin Empire stood as both marvel and paradox. To the eyes of contemporaries, Henry II was the master of lands more extensive than those of any king in the West. His dominion stretched from the borders of Scotland to the mountains of Spain, encompassing fertile valleys, bustling ports, vineyards, forests, and castles without number. It was a realm of immense resources, unrivaled wealth, and cultural brilliance. Yet beneath its dazzling surface lay a fragility that could not be ignored. The empire's strength was vast, but its nature was scattered. Its power immense, but its unity tenuous. The very diversity that enriched the empire also created its greatest challenges. England was an island kingdom with its own common law and traditions of governance. Normandy clung to its ducal customs, its nobles proud of their Norman heritage and wary of being treated as mere subjects of a distant king. Anjou, Henry's birthplace, bred lords of fierce independence, restless and energetic, who were accustomed to negotiating power with their counts rather than submitting blindly. Aquitaine, added through Eleanor, was a world apart, a land of troubadours, courts of chivalry, and a proud nobility whose loyalty lay more with their duchess than with any northern overlord. Gascony, with its vineyards and ports, looked south toward Spain as often as north toward Paris or London. Even the footholds in Ireland, tenuous and incomplete, represented a realm whose languages, customs, and loyalties were far removed from the rest of Henry's dominion. Henry's genius was that he managed to bind these disparate regions under his authority. His constant motion, riding from one court to another, holding assemblies in Normandy, councils in England, judgments in Aquitaine, was the thread that stitched the patchwork together. He was, in truth, the empire's only center. His presence brought coherence. His absence risked disintegration. Unlike the Capetian king, who ruled a small but compact domain, Henry commanded a vast but diffuse one, united less by law or bureaucracy than by the relentless energy of its ruler. This reality placed extraordinary demands upon him. Governance required not only armies and revenues, but also the delicate art of balancing cultures, languages, and expectations. Henry could not impose a single system upon all his lands. Instead, he had to respect their differences while asserting his supremacy. In England, he relied upon sheriffs and the exchequer, building a disciplined financial machine. In Normandy, he honored ducal customs, ensuring that his authority appeared as the continuation of tradition. In Aquitaine, he relied on Eleanor's influence, acknowledging that her presence was the key to securing loyalty. Thus, his empire was not a state, but a federation of territories, each bound together only through his capacity to command them all. The strength of this arrangement was also its weakness. As long as Henry lived, the system held. His vigor, his determination, his ceaseless travel kept the lords of Anjou, the counts of Poitou, the sheriffs of England, and the bishops of Normandy all aware of his watchful gaze. But everyone could see the precariousness. Should Henry falter, should he die without strong successors, the empire might fracture as swiftly as it had been assembled. Its size was breathtaking, but its cohesion was fragile, dependent not on institutions, but on the restless drive of one man. Contemporaries sensed this duality. To admirers, Henry was the greatest monarch of his age, a ruler who commanded more than the King of France, and who seemed capable of reshaping the destiny of Europe. To skeptics, his empire resembled a giant with feet of clay, a dominion too sprawling to endure, too dependent on the will of a single individual. Both perceptions held truth. The Angevin Empire was indeed mighty, but it was also unstable, a bold experiment in ruling a multi-nation realm centuries before the concept of empire would be formalized. The tension between power and fragility defined Henry's reign. His achievements were monumental. Law restored in England, castles dismantled, revenues disciplined, territories expanded, yet always in the background loomed the challenge of holding together lands whose only true bond was his authority. The Angevin Empire was at once Henry's greatest triumph and his most enduring challenge. It was the embodiment of both his ambition and the inherent limits of medieval monarchy. Thus, in the figure of Henry riding across his dominions, we see both majesty and burden. His cloak of red symbolized not only command, but also the ceaseless labor required to maintain it. The Angevin Empire glittered like a jewel upon his brow, larger and brighter than that of any king of France, yet it was a jewel whose settings were delicate, always at risk of loosening, strong yet scattered, brilliant yet fragile. This was the double-edged legacy of Henry's dominion, a realm that revealed both the possibilities and the perils of power stretched across nations. Among Henry II's many achievements, none would prove more enduring than his reshaping of English law. If castles and armies secured his authority in the short term, it was law that cemented it for centuries to come. In a realm long fractured by civil war and divided by local customs, Henry envisioned a system that would bind the kingdom together not only by loyalty to the crown, but also by common rules of justice. What emerged under his reign was the early foundation of what posterity would call the common law, a body of principles not limited to one shire or one lord's hall, but shared across the land, giving England a unity of practice that would outlast kings and dynasties alike. The problem Henry faced was stark. After the long years of Stephen's reign, justice had become inconsistent. In some regions, barons held their own courts, delivering verdicts that suited their interests. In others, local customs, often ancient and unwritten, dictated outcomes. A man might find himself treated one way in Yorkshire and quite differently in Kent for this same offense. For a king determined to restore order, this patchwork was intolerable. Law had to become not the possession of local lords, but the expression of royal authority, applied equally and visibly throughout the realm. Henry's solution was revolutionary for its time. He dispatched royal justices to travel across the kingdom, carrying the authority of the crown into shires and towns. These traveling justices, known in later centuries as justices in air, heard cases on the king's behalf, imposing a measure of uniformity, where before there had been only variation. They were more than judges, they were instruments of royal presence. Wherever they arrived, they reminded subjects that the king's justice was not distant, but at hand, available to rich and poor alike. The system had profound effects. Disputes that once languished in private courts now came before the king's men. Sheriffs, previously unchecked, found themselves supervised. Litigants discovered that appeals could rise beyond their lord's hall to the crown itself. In this way, the authority of Henry reached into villages and market squares, touching the daily lives of his subjects. To stand before a royal justice was to stand, in a sense, before the king himself. Henry did not abolish local custom entirely. He was too practical for that, but he overlaid it with a framework that ensured consistency. The decisions of traveling justices began to be recorded and consulted, creating precedents that future judgments could follow. Over time, these precedents would weave together into a coherent fabric. A common law, common because it was shared across the kingdom, and common because it belonged not to one locality, but to all. For contemporaries, the significance of this shift was immense. Where once law had seemed the tool of the powerful, now it bore the imprint of the crown, a higher authority that at least in theory transcended private interest. Ordinary men and women, though still bound by their stations, found in the king's courts a measure of predictability. Barons, though still influential, could no longer rule unchecked in matters of justice, and the king himself gained a new kind of power, not just the sword to punish, but the law to govern. The traveling justices also symbolized the new spirit of monarchy. Henry was not content to sit in Westminster or Rouen and wait for petitions to come. Like the Angevin restlessness that drove him across his empire, his justices moved ceaselessly, bringing royal oversight into every corner. Their presence was a visible sign of the crown's determination to touch the lives of all its subjects, not merely the noble elite. In this sense, Henry's legal reforms were an extension of his own personality, active, vigorous, unwilling to let matters drift. The legacy of these reforms would extend far beyond Henry's reign. Common law became the backbone of English governance, shaping not only the medieval kingdom, but future centuries, influencing systems of law across the English-speaking world. Yet in Henry's own time, the importance lay in stability. A kingdom once fractured by arbitrary justice was learning to expect consistency, to look to the crown as the source of order. Thus, in the halls of shire courts and the chambers of monasteries where cases were heard, as much as on the battlefields or in the council chambers of kings, Henry II's reign reshaped England. His legacy was not merely in the territories he ruled or the castles he built or destroyed, but in the enduring system of justice that carried his authority into every parish and village. The traveling justices, cloaked in the king's commission, were the embodiment of a new idea that the law of the land was not fragmented and local, but unified and royal. In this vision, Henry stood not only as a warrior king, but as a lawgiver, a ruler whose determination to restore order gave England one of its most lasting institutions. The common law, born of his reforms, would become his greatest monument, a monument not of stone, but of principle, binding his kingdom together long after his own restless life had passed into history. In 1166, more than a decade into his reign, Henry II took a decisive step that would forever alter the administration of justice in England. At Clarendon, a royal manor set amid the woods of Wiltshire, he issued a set of ordinances that came to be known as the Assize of Clarendon. These were not mere administrative instructions, but the blueprint for a new way of organizing justice, a system that drew the kingdom closer to the crown and laid the groundwork for one of England's most lasting institutions: trial by jury. The assize began with a simple but radical idea. In every shire and hundred, 12 lawful men were to be chosen, men of standing in their communities, and sworn to speak the truth. Their task was to present before the king's justices those suspected of crimes, not through accusation by a single lord or neighbor, but by the collective testimony of the community itself. In this innovation lay the seed of the jury, a body that would stand between ruler and subject, transforming the relationship between law and people. For centuries, disputes had often been settled by ordeals or oaths, methods that placed fate in the realm of ritual and chance. A man might prove innocence by grasping hot iron or by gathering oath helpers to swear to his character. Such practices reflected a world where divine judgment was called upon to decide what human judgment could not. Henry's ordinances did not abolish these forms overnight, but they shifted the center of justice from superstition to inquiry, from ritual to testimony. The assize also strengthened the machinery of royal justice. It declared that serious crimes, theft, robbery, and murder, must be investigated and punished under the authority of the king's courts, not left to the whims of local lords. The jury of presentment became the means by which suspects were identified, and the king's justices ensured that their cases were heard. In this way, the reach of the crown extended deep into the shires. Law was no longer merely local, it was national, shaped by royal oversight. Chroniclers observed the profound change. The people of each district gathered to make sworn testimony, now found themselves participants in the process of justice. Their voices carried weight in identifying wrongdoers, and their role gave legitimacy to the judgments that followed. Though still rudimentary compared to later centuries, the system marked a departure from arbitrary rule. It was justice grounded in the knowledge of the community, guided by the authority of the king. The Assize of Clarendon also revealed Henry's pragmatic genius. He understood that a kingdom as vast and diverse as his could not be ruled by force alone. Order required cooperation, and cooperation required trust. By involving local men in the machinery of justice, he gave communities a stake in the crown's authority. The people were not merely subjects to be ruled, they became participants in the process that upheld the king's peace. For Henry, the measure was both practical and visionary. Practically, it made the detection of crime more systematic, replacing haphazard accusations with structured inquiries. Visionarily, it created a principle that would echo through the centuries, that justice was not only the command of a king, but the collective judgment of a community. In time, this principle would evolve into the trial by jury, one of the hallmarks of English law and a symbol of liberty across the world. In 1166, however, it was still the beginning. The Assize of Clarendon did not immediately abolish the old ordeals, nor did it create the full jury trial as later ages would know it. But it planted the seed. In its insistence that communities bear witness, in its demand that justice be centralized under the crown, it pointed the way toward a legal culture that valued testimony, inquiry, and fairness above ritual and chance. Thus, in the quiet halls of Clarendon, a new chapter of English law was written. No banners flew, no battles were fought, yet the ordinances Henry issued there would outlast fortresses and campaigns. The Assize of Clarendon was a moment when the crown's authority and the people's participation met in a single system, creating a legacy that still shapes the very idea of justice today. The reforms Henry II set in motion were not fleeting measures for a troubled age. They became the pillars of a legal tradition that endures to this day. While kings and dynasties rose and fell, while wars reshaped borders and faiths divided kingdoms, the structures of justice that Henry established remained. His vision of common law, of juries, and of royal oversight in the courts outlasted his reign and became one of England's most enduring legacies to the world. In the 12th century, when Henry summoned his justices to ride through the shires, it was a radical experiment. No one could have foreseen that this machinery of justice, born from the king's need for order and authority, would survive nearly 1,000 years. Yet from those first itinerant judges, from the ordinances at Clarendon, from the insistence that law should be uniform and rooted in evidence, there emerged a tradition that shaped the entire English-speaking world. The long-term impact can be traced through centuries. The jury of presentment evolved into the trial jury, where not only the community identified suspects, but also judged their guilt or innocence. The notion that no man could be condemned without lawful process took root, slowly growing into the principle of due process. Precedent, established under Henry's reforms, became the lifeblood of English law, ensuring that decisions were not arbitrary but consistent, anchored in what had come before. Out of the needs of one restless king came a system of continuity, stability, and fairness that extended far beyond his time. The image is easy to summon. A darkened hall, its stone walls lit by the flicker of candles. At the center, a royal justice sits at a wooden table, parchments before him. As villagers and barons alike gather to witness proceedings, he lifts his voice not as a private lord, but as the mouthpiece of the king. In the name of the crown, he declares, and the hall listens. In that moment, the presence of monarchy touches the lives of ordinary people, not through the clang of battle, but through the solemn rituals of law. This image carried a power that was both practical and symbolic. Practical because it created order where once there had been chaos. Symbolic because it redefined what it meant to be ruled. Authority was no longer just the ability to command armies or to build castles. It was also the ability to define justice. For subjects, the law was no longer an instrument of local power, but a bond that tied them to the king. For the king, law became not only a weapon of control, but a bridge to legitimacy. Over the centuries, the legacy expanded. Magna Carta, sealed by Henry's son John in 1215, drew upon the expectation that law should restrain even the crown. The legal reforms of the Plantagenets laid the foundation for Parliament's eventual rise, for the rights claimed by subjects, and for the constitutional developments that defined later England. Beyond England, as the common law traveled with settlers and colonists, it became the inheritance of nations across the globe. From the courthouses of North America to the tribunals of Asia and Africa, echoes of Henry's vision can still be heard. Yet even in its earliest days, the strength of this system lay not only in parchment and precedent, but in the impression it left upon the imagination. The sight of a justice cloaked in the authority of the king, pronouncing judgment in a village court, lingered in memory. It told people that they lived in a kingdom where the law was not distant but present, not arbitrary but shared. It gave to English society a sense of unity that no amount of warfare or conquest could so easily destroy. Henry himself may never have imagined the full extent of what he created. He sought order for his reign, discipline for his nobles, and revenues for his treasury. Yet in pursuing these goals, he gave his kingdom something greater, a legal tradition that became part of its very identity. The law, shaped in his time, became the measure by which future kings were judged, and the legacy by which England distinguished itself among nations. Thus, the candlelit court of the 12th century is more than a scene of history. It is a symbol of continuity. The voice of the royal justice reading the king's command resonates still, for it marks the birth of a system where law outlives rulers, where justice binds generations, and where the foundations laid by Henry II remain the cornerstone of a tradition that has endured through the centuries. Among the many figures who crossed Henry II's turbulent reign, none would cast a longer shadow than Thomas Becket. Their story began in friendship and ended in bitter enmity, a drama that revealed the deepest fault line of the 12th century, the struggle between crown and church. When Henry first elevated Becket, he saw in him not a rival but an ally. Becket was a man of talent, born not into nobility, but into the merchant class of London. Quick-witted, skilled in diplomacy, and unfailingly loyal, he rose swiftly in royal service. As Chancellor of England, he became one of Henry's closest confidants, sharing in his campaigns and counsels. Chroniclers describe the two as inseparable, bound by affection and ambition. Henry, fiery and restless, saw in Becket a companion who could match his intellect and carry out his will. Together, they pursued the king's policies with vigor, reforming administration and restoring the dignity of the crown. But in 1162, the death of Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury, created a vacancy at the head of the English Church. For Henry, the opportunity seemed ideal. By raising his trusted friend to the highest ecclesiastical office, he believed he could secure royal influence over the church, harnessing its wealth and authority to strengthen his throne. With confidence in Becket's loyalty, Henry pressed for his election, and the chapter of Canterbury, under royal pressure, consented. What Henry expected was a chancellor in a bishop's robe. What he received was something far different. Once consecrated as archbishop, Becket underwent a transformation. Shedding the trappings of his former life, he embraced the austerity of his new role. Where once he had worn fine clothes and enjoyed feasts, he now clothed himself in simple garments and turned to the defense of ecclesiastical rights with uncompromising zeal. He no longer spoke as the king's servant, but as the champion of the church. For Henry, this shift was a bitter shock. He had imagined an archbishop who would bend to his designs. Instead, he found a rival as unyielding as himself. The king sought to bring clerics accused of crimes under royal courts, insisting that no subject could stand outside his justice. Becket resisted, defending the church's ancient privilege to judge its own. To Henry, this was obstruction. To Becket, it was duty. Their friendship, once a bond of shared purpose, now cracked under the weight of principle. The tension between them became emblematic of a larger struggle. Across Europe, monarchs and popes vied for supremacy, each seeking to define the limits of power. In England, the conflict found its stage in the relationship between Henry and his former chancellor. Their quarrel was not merely personal, but symbolic. A contest between two authorities, each claiming divine sanction. The crown demanded obedience. The church demanded freedom. Neither man was inclined to yield. In council halls and before assemblies, their disputes played out. Henry, fierce in temper, demanded recognition of his customs. Becket, resolute in conscience, refused. Chroniclers note the drama of their confrontations, the king's sharp words, the archbishop's unwavering stance, courtiers caught between loyalty to crown and reverence for church. What had once been camaraderie had become a duel of wills, each man driven by conviction, each unwilling to compromise. The spectacle unsettled the realm. Nobles feared the instability of divided authority. Clergy rallied to Becket's cause, while barons weighed the danger of offending either master. Ordinary people, watching from afar, saw in the clash the collision of two worlds, the temporal sword and the spiritual crozier, each struggling to dominate. Thus, the story of Henry and Becket moved from harmony to hostility. What began as friendship forged in service had become one of the most dramatic rivalries of the age. In their struggle lay not only the fate of two men, but the enduring question of where ultimate authority resided, with the crown that ruled the land, or with the church that claimed to guide souls. It was a question that would haunt England for generations, first ignited in the broken friendship of a king and his archbishop. The quarrel between Henry II and Thomas Becket deepened swiftly, moving from words of disagreement to the formal language of law. In 1164, at the royal manor of Clarendon, Henry sought to define once and for all the relationship between crown and church. What emerged were the Constitutions of Clarendon, a set of articles that attempted to bind the English church more closely to royal authority, and in doing so, brought the king and his archbishop to the brink of open rupture. Henry's grievance was clear. For too long, clerics accused of crimes had escaped the reach of royal justice. In the courts of the church, punishments were lighter, often limited to penance or removal from office. To the king, this was an affront to order. How could his realm remain stable if one class of men, nearly a tenth of the population, claimed immunity from his law? Henry demanded that all subjects, whether cleric or layman, fall under the jurisdiction of the crown. The Constitutions of Clarendon spelled out this demand in detail. 16 clauses sought to codify the customs by which church and state should interact. Among them was the assertion that clerics convicted in ecclesiastical courts should be handed over to royal courts for further punishment. Another clause insisted that no appeal could be made to Rome without the king's consent, binding the English church more tightly to the realm. Other articles touched upon disputes over benefices, the movement of clergy, and the king's right to intervene in ecclesiastical elections. For Henry, these articles were a declaration of sovereignty. They proclaimed that in England, the crown stood above all, that no institution, however sacred, could stand outside the reach of royal power. To him, it was not an attack on faith, but a defense of unity and justice. For Becket, however, the constitutions were nothing less than a betrayal of the church's ancient liberties. To submit would be to place God's servants under the dominion of secular authority, a compromise he could not accept. The assembly at Clarendon became the stage for their confrontation. Henry pressed his lords and bishops to assent, framing the articles as the restoration of ancient customs. Many, unwilling to oppose the king openly, gave their approval. Becket, caught between loyalty to his monarch and duty to his office, hesitated. At first, under immense pressure, he seemed to yield, placing his seal upon the constitutions. But almost immediately, he recoiled, regretting what he saw as weakness, and soon after declared his resistance. This vacillation only deepened the rift. Henry saw betrayal, Becket saw conscience. Their conflict spilled into exile, appeals to the Pope, and years of bitterness. Yet the Constitutions of Clarendon remained a turning point, for they crystallized the stakes of the struggle. No longer was it a quarrel of personalities. It was a battle over principle, the question of whether the king's authority could claim supremacy, even over the church within his realm. The scene lingers in memory. The hall at Clarendon, nobles and prelates gathered, candles flickering against the stone. The king, stern and unyielding, insists upon his customs. The archbishop, grave and troubled, stands torn between obedience and defiance. Their words echo not only in the chamber, but across the kingdom, for all knew that what was at issue was more than a single document. It was the shape of authority itself, the delicate balance between crown and altar. Thus, in 1164, the friendship that had once bound Henry and Becket dissolved into open hostility, formalized in parchment, and sealed with defiance. The constitutions of Clarendon were not merely clauses of law, they were the manifesto of a monarch determined to rein in the power of the church and the catalyst for one of the greatest conflicts of the Middle Ages. The quarrel between Henry II and Thomas Becket, once rooted in friendship, reached its terrible climax in the closing days of 1170. After years of exile, negotiation, and fragile reconciliation, Becket returned to Canterbury, resuming his seat as archbishop. To his supporters, he came back as a hero of conscience, a shepherd who had defended the liberties of the church against the most powerful monarch in Christendom. To Henry, still simmering with resentment, Becket was a thorn, a reminder that even kings could be defied within their own realm. In December, tensions boiled over. Disputes over the coronation of Henry's son, performed without Becket's sanction, had reopened old wounds. Reports reached the king that the archbishop was excommunicating royal officials and standing once more in open defiance. In his court at Normandy, surrounded by barons and knights, Henry's frustration spilled into bitter words. What exactly he said, chroniclers differ. Some record a cry of despair, others a phrase of fury. But his meaning was clear enough to those who heard. Why should he endure such defiance from the man he had raised so high? 4 knights, loyal to the crown and eager to prove their devotion, took those words as a summons. Without the king's direct command, but carried by the heat of his anger, they crossed the channel and made their way to Canterbury. Their arrival at the great cathedral was sudden, startling clergy and townsfolk alike. Becket, warned of their presence, refused to flee. "This is God's house," he is said to have declared. "I will not leave it." With calm resolve, he entered the nave, preparing to face whatever came. The evening was cold and dimly lit, the stone pillars rising into shadow, the flicker of candles casting long shapes on the floor. The knights confronted the archbishop beneath those arches, demanding submission to the king's will. Becket stood firm. He had yielded once at Clarendon, and he would not yield again. His voice, steady and solemn, declared that the rights of the church were not his to surrender. The confrontation, sharp and tense, ended in violence. Before the altar of Canterbury, the archbishop fell, struck down within the sanctuary itself. The news spread with astonishing speed. Across England and beyond, people whispered of the unthinkable. The king's old friend, now his greatest rival, slain in the holiest place of the realm. To many, Becket's death was not merely a political tragedy, but a martyrdom. The image of the archbishop in his cathedral, the candles glowing faintly above, and the shadow of his fall beneath the vaults etched itself into the imagination of the age. For Henry, the consequences were immediate and severe. Though he denied giving any order, the world held him responsible. His anger had unleashed a deed that shocked Christendom. The Pope mourned and prepared to act, while pilgrims began to flock to Canterbury, revering the site as holy ground. Within a few years, miracles were reported at Becket's tomb, and he was canonized as a saint. The king, once so determined to bring the church to heel, now found himself humbled, forced to perform public penance and seek reconciliation with the very institution he had tried to master. Thus, the conflict between Henry and Becket ended not in compromise, but in catastrophe. What had begun as trust and loyalty became defiance and bloodshed. What had begun as an effort to assert royal authority ended in the elevation of Becket as a symbol of resistance. In the candlelit nave of Canterbury, with shadows dancing on cold stone, a drama of friendship turned to rivalry found its grim conclusion, and in that moment, history was transformed. The death of Thomas Becket sent shockwaves across Christendom. What had begun as a quarrel between king and archbishop now reverberated as a moral reckoning for Henry II. However fiercely he denied giving the order, however passionately he claimed the knights had acted of their own accord, the world saw only one truth. A king's anger had brought violence into the sanctuary of the church. In that moment, Henry's authority, once so unshakable, trembled beneath the weight of outrage. The reaction was swift and overwhelming. News of Becket's martyrdom spread across Europe, and with it, a tide of reverence. Pilgrims flocked to Canterbury to kneel at his tomb, lighting candles and whispering prayers. Stories of miracles began to circulate, each one adding to Becket's growing sanctity. Within just 3 years, the Pope canonized him as Saint Thomas of Canterbury. The very figure Henry had sought to bend had now been exalted beyond royal reach, turned into a symbol of defiance against secular intrusion into sacred rites. For Henry, the consequences were devastating. Not only did his enemies at court whisper of divine punishment, but the papacy itself held him accountable. Threats of interdict and excommunication hung over his crown. The ruler who had sought to dominate the church now stood in danger of being cast outside its fold. Diplomacy could not repair the wound. Only penance could. And so, the king who had commanded armies and defied barons found himself compelled to bow before the spiritual power he had once tried to master. In July 1174, Henry performed one of the most extraordinary acts of contrition in medieval history. At the cathedral in Canterbury, he walked barefoot through the streets, stripped of royal finery, humbling himself before the shrine of the man who had once been his friend and later his foe. There, beneath the arches of the great church, he knelt and submitted to public penance. Chroniclers record that he accepted scourging at the hands of monks, a spectacle that astonished all who witnessed it. In this act, Henry sought not only forgiveness from God, but also reconciliation with his people and the wider church. The imagery was unforgettable. The most powerful king of his age, brought low in the very place where his rival had fallen, confessing through ritual what the world already believed, that his will had unleashed a tragedy that no crown could excuse. The penance did not erase the past, but it transformed Henry's standing. To the people he appeared as a monarch who, though proud, could humble himself before a higher power. To the church he was once again a son of the faith, chastened but restored. The political consequences were equally profound. Becket's martyrdom had given the church a renewed moral authority. No king could henceforth ignore the weight of ecclesiastical power. Every monarch after Henry knew that to confront the church was to risk not only political turmoil, but also the judgment of history. Canterbury became a beacon of pilgrimage, its shrine glittering with offerings, its name spoken in reverence across Europe. The church, once pressured by Henry's constitutions of Clarendon, emerged stronger, its liberties not diminished, but exalted through the sacrifice of its archbishop. For Henry, the years that followed were a paradox. He remained a formidable ruler, expanding his dominions and reforming his courts. Yet the shadow of Becket lingered over his reign. Every victory was tempered by memory. Every decision weighed against the lesson of Canterbury. His legacy, though vast, could never be told without the story of the friend turned adversary, the martyr who reshaped the balance between crown and altar. Thus, the aftermath of 1170 was not only Henry's humiliation, but also England's transformation. The penitent king and the canonized saint became enduring symbols, their intertwined fates marking a turning point in medieval history. Authority had been tested, pride had been broken, and the church, bathed in the light of martyrdom, emerged with a moral force that kings themselves could not ignore. The Plantagenet Dynasty, raised from the restless energy of Henry II, seemed destined for greatness. Through inheritance, marriage, and conquest, Henry had built a realm that stretched wider than the lands of any king in the West. He was a man of tireless vigor, a king who restored order after an age of chaos, reformed justice, and commanded authority over England and vast swaths of France. Yet for all his triumphs, his greatest struggle would not come from his enemies abroad, nor from rebellious barons within his kingdom, but from those bound to him by blood. In the years after Becket's death, when the stain of Canterbury still shadowed his reign, Henry faced a crisis that revealed the most painful truth of kingship, that a ruler may command half of Europe, yet fail to command his own household. The marriage of Henry and Eleanor of Aquitaine had once shown as one of the most dazzling unions of the Middle Ages. Together, they embodied ambition and brilliance, ruling lands that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Eleanor had brought with her Aquitaine, one of the richest duchies in Christendom, and for a time, husband and wife seemed inseparable partners in empire. But Henry was a man who brooked no equal, not even in his queen. His ceaseless travels, his constant drive to dominate, and his well-known infidelities strained their bond. Eleanor, proud and independent, grew resentful. She had ruled Aquitaine in her own right long before Henry and was not content to be set aside. By the 1170s, their union had decayed. Affection turned to suspicion, suspicion to rivalry. Eleanor's frustration soon found an outlet in the ambitions of her sons. Henry had fathered a brood of princes, Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John. To secure the line of succession, he had crowned the eldest, the young king, in 1170. The boy wore a crown, bore the title of king, and basked in ceremony. But Henry kept all real authority in his own hands. The treasury, the castles, the machinery of government remained tightly under the elder Henry's control. The son had the shadow of kingship, but not its substance. To a young man proud of his station, this was intolerable. The young king's discontent was fanned by courtiers and by his mother. Richard, destined for Aquitaine, and Geoffrey, set for Brittany, also bristled under their father's dominance. Even John, though still a child, was drawn into the intrigues of inheritance. The princes began to imagine a future not of obedience, but of rule. Eleanor, seeing in her husband's intransigence a denial of her son's rights, encouraged them. She whispered that they must press for their due, that they could not wait forever under their father's shadow. Thus, a family quarrel grew into something larger, a spark that would ignite rebellion across the empire. By 1173, the storm broke. The young king fled his father's court and sought refuge with Louis VII of France, Eleanor's former husband and Henry's perennial enemy. Richard and Geoffrey joined him. Barons in Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine seized the opportunity to resist the king they had long resented. In England, magnates plotted, and in the north, William the Lion of Scotland prepared to strike. What began as the grievances of princes swelled into a full-scale insurrection, stretching from the frontiers of Scotland to the fields of Poitou. For Henry, the betrayal was shattering. He had faced conspiracies before, but never had he imagined that his own sons would rise against him with their mother's blessing. Chroniclers recorded the pathos of the scene. A father at war with his children, a dynasty tearing itself apart. The image of the king, once triumphant and unassailable, now threatened by his own blood, struck contemporaries with a sense of tragic inevitability. Power had made Henry master of kingdoms, but not of the human heart. The rebellion tested every resource of his being. At nearly 40, worn by years of labor, Henry might have faltered. Instead, he showed the same tireless energy that had built his empire. He rushed across the Channel, rallying loyal lords in Normandy, then sped back to England to put down uprisings among the barons. He fought with sword and with diplomacy, isolating his enemies, bribing some, crushing others. His armies clashed with those of his sons and their allies, battles fought not only for territory, but for the soul of the dynasty. Yet even as Henry fought, tragedy unfolded within his family. Eleanor herself attempted to join her sons, but was intercepted and taken prisoner. The Queen of Aquitaine, once the proud partner of a king, was now confined, a captive of her husband. For the next 16 years, she would live under varying degrees of restraint, her influence curbed, her voice silenced. Henry had subdued his wife, but at what cost? The partnership that had once formed the foundation of the Angevin Empire had been shattered beyond repair. The rebellion's climax came in 1174. Henry's fortunes seemed on the brink of collapse, his empire threatened on all fronts. In the midst of this storm, he performed an extraordinary act, penance at the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury. Barefoot, stripped of royal finery, he humbled himself before the saint who had once been his friend and rival. That very night, William the Lion of Scotland was captured in battle. To contemporaries, it seemed a sign of divine favor. The tide turned, and within months, the rebellion unraveled. The princes, outmaneuvered and inexperienced, could not sustain their cause. The young king, though crowned, lacked the authority to lead. Richard, brave and fierce, was still too young. Geoffrey's support in Brittany faltered. One by one, their allies fell away. Their armies dissolved, and the barons who had defied Henry bent once more to his rule. The great revolt that had threatened to tear the Angevin Empire apart collapsed in defeat. Henry emerged victorious, but victory carried a bitter taste. He had defended his throne, but against his own family. The peace terms reflected his dominance but also his pragmatism. The young king was restored to honor but granted only revenues, not real power. Richard and Geoffrey received confirmation of their inheritances but swore renewed loyalty. Eleanor remained in confinement. The rebellion had ended, but the wounds it left were raw and unhealed. In the years that followed, the scars deepened. The young king, restless and extravagant, died in 1183, consumed by ambition, unfulfilled. Richard rose to prominence, a warrior destined for fame as the Lionheart, yet his relationship with his father remained one of tension and conflict. Geoffrey perished in Brittany in 1186, leaving a legacy of unrest. John, the youngest, would inherit the crown, but under circumstances steeped in discord. The family, bound by blood and ambition, seemed doomed to rivalry. For Henry, the memory of the revolt never left him. Chroniclers describe him in later years as a man hardened by betrayal, his once fierce laughter muted, his confidence shadowed by sorrow. He ruled with vigor, reforming courts, managing his vast dominions, and holding his empire together. But he could never forget that his own sons had turned against him, that his queen had chosen rebellion over loyalty. The great king, so mighty against external foes, had been wounded most deeply within his own household. The tragedy of the Plantagenets was that their greatness carried within it the seeds of division. Henry's empire was vast, but it was a patchwork, bound by his personal authority rather than lasting institutions. His family mirrored his realm, brilliant, ambitious, but fragile, torn by rivalries that his iron will could not contain. The rebellion of 1173 and 1174 revealed both the strength and weakness of his monarchy, strong enough to survive the storm, yet vulnerable to the ambitions of its own heirs. The chronicles remember Henry as a king of immense energy, a builder of law, a restorer of order, but also as a man whose reign was haunted by the conflict with his family. The image endures of the king victorious yet wounded, triumphant yet lonely, his empire secure but his household divided. The revolt did not topple him, but it left scars that never healed, shaping the destiny of the Plantagenet Dynasty for generations to come. Thus, the story of Henry and his family stands as a parable of medieval kingship. Power won by ambition must contend with ambition within. The empire that stretched from England to the Pyrenees was not undone by foreign enemies, but by quarrels in the royal household. In the great halls of Westminster, in the castles of Normandy, in the vineyards of Aquitaine, whispers of betrayal and resentment eroded the bonds of loyalty. Kings may rule kingdoms, but families rule the heart. And there, Henry II, the greatest monarch of his age, found his most painful defeat. The last decade of Henry II's reign was marked by triumphs still, but also by weariness, betrayal, and the slow collapse of the bonds he had fought all his life to preserve. Though his authority remained vast, though his empire stretched from the North Sea to the Pyrenees, the energy that had once driven him endlessly across his dominions began to falter under the weight of age and sorrow. The greatest enemy he faced in those years was no foreign king, no rebellious baron, but the disloyalty of his own house, the same tragedy that had haunted him since the Great Revolt. The young king, Henry's firstborn, had died in 1183 after years of restless ambition and extravagance, leaving behind only bitterness and a tarnished legacy. Geoffrey of Brittany followed him to the grave in 1186, his death sudden and untimely. These losses shook the king deeply, for however strained their relationships had been, they were still his sons, and with each passing he saw the shadow of mortality drawing closer to himself. Yet the greatest blow was yet to come, for the surviving heirs, Richard and John, would turn against him in the twilight of his reign. Richard, strong, commanding, and adored by Aquitaine, had long chafed under his father's control. He yearned not only for autonomy, but for the recognition that he, and not John, should be Henry's chosen successor. John, the youngest, had been his father's favorite, and Henry's attempts to carve out lands and titles for him fueled Richard's fury. The seeds of rivalry bloomed into open defiance when Richard allied himself with Philip II of France, a monarch every bit as ambitious and cunning as Henry had once been in his youth. Together, the French king and Henry's son pressed him hard, exploiting his age, his exhaustion, and his fractured household. In these final years, Henry continued to move across his empire, as he always had, riding from Normandy to Anjou, from England to Aquitaine. But the vigor that had once awed contemporaries was waning. His body, worn from decades in the saddle, bent under the strain. His mind, though still sharp, was clouded by sorrow. Chroniclers describe him as restless still, unable to sit idle, yet carrying with him the heaviness of disappointment. The laughter of earlier days was gone, replaced by suspicion and weariness. The king, who had once been feared for his ferocity, now seemed haunted, pursued not by armies, but by memories. In 1189, the storm he had long dreaded broke. Richard, allied with Philip of France, marched against his father with relentless determination. Betrayals spread through Henry's camp. Barons defected. Castles fell. The king fought as best he could, but the tide of fortune had turned. Forced into submission at Chinon, Henry was compelled to accept humiliating terms. Among them was the demand that Richard, his son, be recognized as heir. As if this humiliation were not enough, Henry was handed a list of those who had betrayed him. At the top was the name he had never wished to see. John, the son he had loved most, had deserted him. That revelation broke him. Wounded by war, exhausted by years of struggle, and now betrayed by the last son in whom he had placed his trust, Henry collapsed. Within days he lay dying at Chinon, the walls of the castle echoing with the prayers of monks. On the 6th of July, 1189, he breathed his last. His long reign ended not in triumph, but in sorrow. He was 66 years old. Chroniclers say that as he lay dying, he turned his face to the wall, murmuring, "Shame, shame on a conquered king." And yet, though his end was bitter, his legacy was immense. Henry II had restored order to a broken England, shattered after the Anarchy. He had dismantled adulterine castles, curbed the power of barons, and built a monarchy that stood upon stronger foundations than any before him. His reforms of law, the common law, the traveling justices, the beginnings of trial by jury, shaped not only his own age, but the very character of English governance for centuries to come. The empire he forged, stretching across England and France, was dazzling in scope, though too fragile to endure intact. His struggles with Becket revealed the limits of royal power before the might of the church. Yet even in that defeat, he showed a monarchy capable of both pride and penance. Henry was a man of contradictions, ruthless yet pragmatic, brilliant yet impulsive, tender at times yet capable of harshness. He was a king who could summon the energies of an age and bend them to his will, yet who could not master the rivalries of his own family. His life was a drama played out across battlefields, courts, and cathedrals, a story of conquest, reform, betrayal, and resilience. His death marked the end of an era, but not the end of his legacy. His son Richard inherited the crown, and John after him, but both ruled in the long shadow of their father, the founder of the Plantagenet Dynasty. Looking back, the story of Henry II is not only the tale of a single man, but of a transformation. He took a realm broken by civil war and left it a kingdom bound by law. He turned the crown into a symbol of order, reasserted its supremacy over fractious nobles, and planted the seeds of institutions that would outlive him by centuries. His reign was turbulent, his family divided, and his end bitter, but his achievement was nothing less than the foundation of a dynasty that would shape England for generations. And so the story closes with the image of a king who rode endlessly across his dominions, who built and destroyed, who loved and quarreled, who rose to the heights of power and fell under the weight of betrayal. Henry II, the first Plantagenet king, left behind not only an empire of stone and land, but a legacy of law and kingship that endured long after his bones lay in Chinon. His reign was both triumph and tragedy, but it was above all the beginning of a dynasty whose echoes would carry through the centuries, a reminder that power is fleeting, but the structures it creates can endure.